So a lot to talk about here. We're joined now by an economist who's done a lot of work in the field of inequality, Professor Till van Triek from the University of Duisburg-Essen here in Germany. Thanks very much for coming in. So let's talk about Germany first. As we saw in our reports, there is a big gap between the top and the bottom. But how does Germany compare to other developed countries?
Well, if you look at income inequality, traditionally it was relatively low in Germany compared to the OECD average, for example. But over the past 15 years, there has been a very strong increase in income inequality. So this is really a growing concern.
I mean, inequality is often just seen as a social justice issue, isn't it? But you've also done a lot of research on the question of the practical economic impact of inequality, and even looking at the question of whether inequality contributed to the outbreak of the financial crisis in the US in 2007. Can you explain that?
Yeah, many economists now claim that rising inequality has been a major cause of the financial crisis. The argument is relatively simple. In fact, as inequality increases, the purchasing power of the middle classes goes down, and so they have less money in their pockets to buy the things that they need to provide for a certain standard of living, for a certain social status. And so they are basically left with two choices. Either households can go to the banks and try to get a credit and try to maintain their standard of living on credit. Mm-hmm. This is what many households of the middle classes did in the US and also in the UK, but this obviously contributed to the debt crisis in the household sector. The other option that households have is not to go to the banks, not to go into debt, but to reduce their consumption, reduce their standard of living, and this is what many households in Germany did. Yeah. And but this obviously then causes a problem of weak domestic demand. Mm-hmm. and an increasing dependence on exports, and thereby on the rising indebtedness of other countries, which is also not a stable macroeconomic model, as we can see now in the euro crisis.
So, I mean, plenty of economic reasons then, as well as the ethical ones, to try and reduce inequality. I mean, Thomas Piketty, who we mentioned earlier, is calling for a global wealth tax to try and tackle that. Do you think that's the right recipe?
I do think it's the right recipe. Especially wealth inequality is now a big problem. In fact, we don't even really know how big wealth inequality is, because many rich people don't even participate in household surveys, which most of our statistics on wealth inequality are based on. Mm-hmm. So the way I see it is that a global wealth tax would at least help to provide for the necessary data to measure wealth inequality correctly.
But critics say on the free market side of the argument would say, well, if you just increase taxes on the rich, you're not going to help the poor, you're just going to drag the rich down. What do you say to that?
Well, I think after the Second World War, there was a broad consensus among economists that it is, in fact, necessary to have a relatively low degree of income inequality and wealth inequality in order to have a stable economy, because mass incomes are the basis for consumption demand. And if you have a rise in inequality, then you will end up with either over-indebted households or with weak domestic demand. And so if you look back at the 1960s, for example, the top marginal income tax rate in the United States was above 90%. So I think economists and the general public should a little bit remember this old consensus after the war.
It certainly does seem that there could be room for some policy action there. Thank you very much for coming in, Professor Till van Triek.